Hey everyone. Okay, we are with Richard Diaz, and I'm pumped to chat with him because Richard, I think I was just mentioning, Richard, that we stumbled upon some of your charts. I don't know if it was on Twitter. I honestly don't even know. And I just remember seeing Canadian data presented in a chart format because I was going to Stats Canada and trying to pull data and like make sense of things. And we have done some of that in here with our team. But then you were always like putting out this great data. And I thought, like, who the heck is it? Like, there's somebody out there who cares, because I was always going to the U.S. data because the U.S. data is so good. So, for those people who don't know Richard, can you please just introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do? And why are you making these beautiful charts for us to all? I was going to say laugh at the Canadian economy. I shouldn't say that. I should say analyze the Canadian economy. Who are you, and why are you doing all this?
Sure. So my name is Richard Diaz. I am I would say I'm an analyst first and foremost, and I work for a company called IceCap Asset Management, which is based out of Halifax, which is a wealth management company or portfolio management company that caters to families all over the world, really, obviously primarily in Canada. I'm also part of the Loonie Hour. I'm one of the triumvirate, the co-hosts of the Loonie Hour, and then I also do these new things, these vignettes, these YouTube videos that are 8 to 12 minutes long about different topics that really pique my interest or annoy me and that I need to explore and sort of enlighten and educate and entertain and inform people about mostly the Canadian economy. Although I'm going to branch out a little bit next week. We'll see. I've got a new topic sort of at the top of mind that I want to sort of dig into. But yeah, that's me. I mean, at the end of the day, really, I'm just someone who cares about data. I care very, very much about this country. My father, who's no longer with us, he thought this was the best country in the world when he immigrated here. And I still believe it. And I think that the way that maybe my contribution is to just get people to understand a little bit more about where they live and how they can do their part really to improve it. And also, I just love it. It's fun. Let's be, I am not a martyr. I am purely a self-interested person. And I really, really enjoy understanding things, digging into the data and sharing it with people. And that's a little bit about me.
Where was your father from?
He was from Cape Verde, which is a tiny little island or archipelago rather off the coast of Senegal. It was a former Portuguese colony. And my mom's from Portugal. But my mom says she's Portuguese, but she's as Canadian as they come. She's been here since 1968, and my dad, so they were here when they were kids, really.
And then how did you connect?
Sorry?
No, and then how did you connect with the Loonie Hour crew? How did that come to be?
We just sort of, I was just sort of pumping stuff online, and I tried to start my own sort of research business. I'm not a natural entrepreneur by any stretch, and I have a real admiration for people who are. And I sort of stumbled across Keith and Steve. And then when I got wind that they were sort of starting a podcast, I sort of invited myself
Introduced yourself into the, good.
And sort of the rest is history. I mean, it's probably the only good thing to come out of COVID for me personally. And we've just been sort of just chipping away and sort of putting out content that was really based for Canadians, or not even that necessarily, but just really with a view to sort of explaining how the world, the Japanese market and German policies and politicians, and U.S. obviously, and how it affects or doesn't affect the Canadian economy and Canadians, and we have fun with it. I mean, I think we discuss those topics quite seriously, but we don't take ourselves too seriously, and they always make fun of me. I think I'm the butt of most of the jokes, so.
Yeah, are you? Okay. I want to ask you about Canada and energy and Canada's economy and the importance to energy, because it seems like you have an amazing handle on it all. I was recently in Dubai, and it gave me this unique perspective on Canada that I should have. I'm born in Toronto, grew up in Mississauga on the west side of Toronto. Our business is in Oakville. I'm a product of two immigrant parents, Croatian father, Scottish mother. I exist because of this country. Like only in Canada, I think, would those two people meet each other. I'm very thankful for Canada. But then sometimes I do get, I don't know if the word is negative or disappointed or, whatever you call it, because I just see some obvious, fairly straightforward fixes to the economy could really make this country great. And it was really brought home to me when I went to Dubai. And that was back in September of this year, because in Dubai, I just kind of stood back on the beach and looked at this city that is just like risen from the desert. Like it shouldn't exist. There's a metropolitan city there that, to me, I'm like, how did this exist? And I had this one tour guide, young guy, 29, Algerian guy. And he looked at me and he said, Tom, like, well, we should have a great leader and we have money from energy. And, you know, they decided to like really pour this into Dubai and grow Dubai. And he said, you know who has more energy than we do in the UAE? And I'm like, no, who? He goes, well, Venezuela's number one. They don't have a great leader. And then he went to 2 and 3 and he goes, you know, like we're 6. You know who's number 4? And I'm like, no, I don't know. He's like, yeah, like Canada. And he looked at me like I was like, you know, how did I not know? I knew we were I knew we were up there, but I guess I just didn't know we were 4th. And he just said, you have the energy. You know what you're missing. You're just missing some leadership. This is a 29-year-old guy who's just breaking it down so simply for me. And then when I reflected back in that moment on Canada and just thought of all our forests, all our rivers, all our minerals, all the energy that we have, it just became abundantly clear. And I already knew this, but even I think the contrast made it even more so, that the potential Canada has as just an economic power seems unlimited. But we seem to shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit sometimes, in my opinion. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say. So I guess just with that strange little story to kick off there, Richard, what can you talk about like Canada's energy, like from your perspective? And I know you did a video on it yesterday on your YouTube channel that I think is really worth listening to, but can you break that down for us? Like, what does Canada's energy sector look like? What are the new announcements the government just came out with? How should we be thinking about this? Can I just open with a general question like that?
Sure. Yeah. So you can find my video on IceCap Asset Management. Sorry, that's the last time I'll plug anything. But I think that there's a couple of things.
You plug away.
There's like a couple of things I'd like to sort of unpack there, which is I think leadership is part of it, but I think I would maybe make it a little bit more specific. I think we have bad management. Because ultimately, that's what I think politicians, in my view, should be and act like, which is custodians of our natural resources. And I think why someone like me is so frustrated by what's been going on is because I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think you can't exploit your natural resources. We can, as Canadians, exploit our natural resources with duty of care to both the actual land that we're on, as well as the future inhabitants of this planet. We can do it in an ethical way. We can do it in a sustainable way. And I think Canada, unlike I think a lot of countries out there, I think there's a genuine care for trees and water and wildlife and whatever. Totally. And I think the idea that by managing or by like the only way to care for the environment is to never use it or never take any natural resource out of the ground, I think is A, naive, B, is a disassociated from what it takes for human beings to live on this earth. And I think it's a product of a sort of a complacency that I think we're finally starting to see the end of. So that's that piece. Canada is the 4th largest producer of oil in the world. We produce 4.6 million barrels of oil a day. This is sort of stalled. To be honest with you, that was about 2 million barrels about 6 or maybe 10, 15 years ago. So it has increased, but I think it could increase even more, although there's always a bit tricky when you get to commodities. We're the 5th largest producer of natural gas in the world. We have literally every mineral that is required for this, desperate energy transition that people are so apt to talk about. We've got rare earth metals. In the 90s, we used to produce an enormous amount of rare earth metals. It's now all shifted over to China. We'll talk about that later. And so this idea that, Canada, and water, my goodness, we didn't even talk about fresh water. I mean, Quebec just alone, I think, is something like, I want to say something like 10 or 15% of the world's fresh water. So, when the world starts getting thirsty, I have a feeling we're going to need a few defense contractors, but maybe that's a conversation for another day. And so, we can do it. I think what we need to do is we need to stop apologizing for existing. I think we need to lean into the things that I mentioned, which is, I believe genuinely in my heart that Canadians do care about protecting the environment. But protecting the environment does not mean it goes untouched. It means that you exploit it in a responsible way. And I think we can do it. And so, sorry, that's that little diatribe that I had to just get out there. And then as far as the energy sector, I think I mean, if I may continue, like if it's just like, it's amazing how people don't realize that our entire because we have done such a poor job allocating capital in, sorry to say, in real estate or in other types of industries. Right now, and I don't think this should be true forever, but right now, one of the only things really that's sort of propping up our economy is this massive inflow of hard currency, US dollars, via the trade balance and the current account balance. And if without that, I think Canadians would be materially worse off. And that's just sort of an economic fact. And you might think that carbon emissions are the most important problem in the world. You might think that they're the least important problem in the world. But when you look at the current account balance, which is a sort of a table or a chart of trade flows, we effectively exchange energy products for goods of all kinds. Anything you can think of: capital goods, consumer goods, chemicals, on and on and on. And without that exchange, which is almost like a one-for-one exchange, we would have to have a massive, what I call an internal devaluation, which is our current account balance would be unsustainable, which means we would have to have lots of money financing our consumption. But because debt levels are already so high, our lenders, e.g. the world, would start to ask questions of our ability to pay that money back. And then we would have to, tighten our belts, which is something Canadians clearly don't want to do. And that would force an internal devaluation. Or we would have to have an external devaluation, which is our currency would do the hard lifting or the hard work for us, which would ultimately end up in higher inflation and weaker consumption. And because of that interplay, we get loads and loads of hard currency from oil, and we can effectively import massive amounts of goods from the rest of the world. This idea that Canadians just can turn off the tap tomorrow and have no material impact on our standard of living is a fantasy. It is a lie. It is a fantasy, and it's important, in my view, that Canadians understand that. So that's the.
So if I was to say it simply, it's that Canada just does we sell a lot of energy, so a lot of dollars come into the country, into private enterprise, and then as a result also into the federal government, to the governments as taxes. And because that money's flowing back in, we have some money. We have these US dollars that are coming in. We have some money, and that's a good thing. So then now, if I was just to get your opinion on what, I think it's this week. I don't know that you know the announcement much clearer than I do, but the Canadian government announced something this week or last week about capping energy production or whatever it was. What was that about? Can you just describe that announcement?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, just 1 second. We also do export lots of other products and goods, but what matters is the net export number. So I want to be crystal clear.
Okay, and then thank you for doing that. And why are you clearing that up with what I said? Just because energy is not the only thing?
But we do export lots of products and services. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes the way I speak is, or the way the mistake I make is I say we only export oil and we only import goods. And that's not true. We export lots of different products. What matters is the exports minus the imports and how those two net out. Sorry. So I need to be,
that's
for me personally to be sort of really clear with that language. And so
we will attack you with that in the future, Richard. I will go online and I'll say, "Oh, that's the guy who just thinks we'd make energy all day."
Sorry. Yeah, forgive me. I am an analyst and a nerd at heart, and I think it's important. So, but anyway, back to your question. So the latest salvo against oil and gas is about setting the emissions cap to 35% below 2019 levels, and hitting that emissions cap by 2030. It's about establishing a cap and trade system. And it's basically, which is if you reduce your emissions, you can sort of sell that to companies that don't. And so that's fair enough. There's loads of cap and trade systems all over the world. And ultimately, the argument is that it's not about a production cap. It's about reducing emissions in the oil and gas sector, upstream and, on offshore facilities and LNG production, whatever, the whole shebang. And so that is in isolation. That was sort of the announcement that was on Monday, I believe. The days all sort of melt together. But so, but I think what's really, so that if you just take that sort of in a vacuum, it's like, okay, you want to cap emissions, fine. The argument is that these companies have made an incredible amount of money and they should sort of reinvest that money into technologies that lower emissions. Okay, so in isolation, that is, I would argue, not necessarily even a bad thing, maybe, with the proviso that you think emissions are the single most important thing that's ever been created ever. Fine, if you want to tackle emissions, go for it. But the problem is that we know that this administration has a history of attacking, or well, I call it attacking, but trying to regulate and, in my view, strangle or throttle the oil production machine of Canada. And there's carbon pricing, there's the methane regulations. I talk about in my video, there's the zero emissions vehicle mandate, although they put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, which I think is interesting. Then there's Bill C-59, which I think is a draconian overreach, which is basically oil companies and gas companies cannot market any kind of environmental anything about their products and services. For example, natural gas has a much lower emissions coefficient than coal, for example, which is basically, and that trade-off has allowed the US to lower its emissions significantly over the last 20 years. US emissions per capita has basically collapsed, and it's purely a function of the fact that they got off of coal and they swapped out natural gas, and natural gas is 50% less emissions than coal. There's pipeline bans that this government has sort of instituted, either directly or not directly, the transatlantic notwithstanding. We know how they felt about the Keystone pipeline. There's the Impact Assessment Act, which basically dragged out the timeline for all of these projects. And what these companies need is capital, which is fair enough, and clarity. And so the clarity is clear. Why would you invest in Canada when your government literally doesn't want you to and is doing everything in its power to sort of discourage that investment? And then the capital piece is really interesting because there was recently, a couple of weeks ago, a study basically in order to sort of do a regulation via the back door, via the capital markets, and they want to change risk weights for bank loans in order to discourage lending to the fossil fuel industry. All of this basically, which I think is quite nefarious, A, and B, unethical, but that's maybe a different thing. But all this is to say is that the capital expenditure, so CapEx, so investment into equipment and structures in that industry, in the mineral and extraction industry, is basically at a 30-year low in real terms. And it's basically collapsed over the last 10 years. Part of that is because oil has been weaker, but obviously part of that is because it's an environment that doesn't lend itself to investing. And so that's sort of what's happened over the last week or so.
Real estate investing isn't always easy, but it can be relatively simple. And that's where the Rockstar Inner Circle comes in. Look, there's a lot of real estate investing information out there these days. That's why it's so important to pick your sources wisely. And even though investing isn't always going to be the easiest process, it does not have to be super complicated. That's where tried, tested, and proven strategies like the ones that Rockstar members use come into play. Everything shared in the Inner Circle is built from firsthand, on the streets experience in the current market. It's all up to date, things that people are actually implementing today. In fact, the ongoing courses are delivered live, so they're always up to date with the absolute latest real life experiences. As a Rockstar member, get ongoing access to over 20 different systems and programs covering things like which properties investors like and why, our private rental system, what opportunities the investors are scooping up in student housing currently, the legal side of investing, why or how to use corporations as an investor, a mortgage class with the absolute latest options and programs to build your portfolio as an investor, because they're different than a regular home buyer. And there's a whole ton more in all those different classes. Of course, to implement all these strategies, members get access to unlimited private one-on-one coaching with an actual human experienced investor, not an AI chatbot, not ChatGPT or anything like that. It goes beyond training classes in real estate. It's a community for people looking to take control of their own finances, to give themselves options and allow them to live life life on their terms. With ongoing live and virtual opportunities to connect, it's built for investors by investors. You can see everything members get at rockstarinnercircle.com/member. It's rockstarinnercircle.com/member. Now back to the show.
When I just hear you break it down like that, sometimes I'm wondering, like, who are they? Like, who is the current government? I don't understand who they're pandering to. Like, they just believe that there's this body of people out there that are really encouraging this or want this. I don't even understand where this is coming from, because they must have somebody who's looking at the economy at a big picture and understand the economic ramifications of some of these decisions. Like when you're saying we're at like 30% in real terms. Is that what you were saying? 30%?
Sorry. No, sorry. So the CapEx, so capital expenditure in aggregate for the mineral extraction sector of Canada is down at a 30-year low.
Sorry, 30-year low. Okay, 30-year low.
Which is, and I'm happy to share the chart. And what they were saying is that, I mean, I think there's two things to note. One is they argue that capping emissions should not affect production. And I think, again, in isolation, that's not necessarily even a wild thing to say. You know, emissions for the sector have actually been flat over the last 12 years. That's data according to the government of Canada, and it's easy to Google. And production is up. So emissions flat, production is up. And so the idea that we could lower emissions and keep production flat, is not actually it's not a crazy thought. Mm-hmm. The problem is that there's like a litany of different other there's a history of violence. Do you know what I mean? That there's a pattern of behavior, and the pattern is, in my view, very straightforward. They hate the oil industry, and I think what's really important is to understand their motivation, because if you don't understand their motivation, it's difficult to communicate with these people. And the motivation is climate change is the most important existential threat to humanity, and Canada has to do its part. And that is the piece where I find really falls flat, because Canada is 1.6% of global emissions, and it's as if they
and we have a few trees.
I mean, that's for sure. But also, like, if you think emission, and I don't want you to get shadow banned on YouTube, so maybe we should change tact here. But if you think emissions is the single most important problem in the world, then you have to look at China and Asia, because they are doubling down on coal in a way that people in Canada just don't appreciate. And so in my view, it's a giant virtue signal. I think it doesn't matter. Canada can be wiped off the face of the earth tomorrow, and it would make a lick of difference for global emissions. It just wouldn't. It's just math. I mean, literally, it's like literally high school math to just like on a calculator. And so what you're doing is it's a self-flagellation. You are basically, you're martyring Canadian people, mostly working class people who always pay for these shitty decisions, on the altar of this global problem, which is not going to be solved in Canada or any of the other countries, and certainly not by making us poorer. And so that's my little rant on that. But I think there's a lot of, that's sort of my motivation for why I thought it was important to lay out the video.
It's a great rant and it's a great video. So then I guess just shifting gears a little bit for Canadians, because I think you mentioned this in the video and you just kind of alluded to it right now, that the middle class or, people without assets kind of just get washed away in this. What does a Canadian do if you don't have, like, where do Canadians go? Like, obviously, how do they protect themselves from the current fiscal situation, the monetary system that we currently have? Like, what's your take on that? What do people do?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, the problem is, the problem is people don't really appreciate that if you can be unproductive for a little while, and you can run major budget deficits and accumulate lots of debt for a little while, but eventually your credit card has a limit. And I think, and importantly, Canada is not a reserve currency. So people will say, but the US can do whatever they want. Yes, but they're the global reserve currency, and they literally can do whatever they want to a point, obviously. But you know what I'm saying? Like, we are not them. And so Canada her productivity growth has collapsed. I mean, that's very clear according to both the Bank of Canada and Statistics Canada. Carolyn Rogers, the deputy governor, went on to speak about that in March. She literally called it an emergency.
I remember.
And we are saddled with, a basically sort of a real estate sector that has absorbed way too much capital over the last few years.
I don't believe it, Richard. How can you say that? I just don't see it. I don't know what data you're looking at. I just don't see it. I'm joking, obviously. I'm completely joking.
No,
yes.
no. And then the other piece is that, and so the reason that's important is because Canadians, our consumption is 65% of GDP. And as interest rates have gone up, in order to deal with higher inflation, debt servicing costs are absorbing more and more and more of our disposable income, which is hurting consumption. That's pretty straightforward. And then the other piece, because the environment is bad to invest in, both from a political standpoint, as well as a underlying economic standpoint, our overall CapEx, excluding oil and gas and natural resources, is at a 12-year low. So, we just are not, we're not investing in machinery and plants and non-residential structures in the way that we have in the past. So where do you get that next leg of growth? How do you improve productivity if you don't invest in, plants and equipment and machinery? And we do invest in technology, so that's a good piece. I have to, that's important people understand. We do invest in software, and we have improved our research and development spending. But in general, you need sort of all of those pieces to rise in tandem. And so if you don't have productivity and you have weak growth, certainly weak growth in per capita GDP, eventually people will the market will react. And what that means is there will be sort of a lender's strike, and people sort of see that as like this fantasy, this far off problem. The credit card limit's too high, the credit card limit's too high. But we know that eventually you do run into trouble. And to me, it's a purely self-inflicted wound. There's no reason why Canada shouldn't have better productivity. There's no reason why Canada
And so just on this point, because I think you're hitting on something so important right here. So basically what you're saying is that like people will be less interested in Canadian dollars, less interested in Canadian debt. So we lose some demand and the ability for us to finance ourselves with some of the decisions we're making in the economy.
Yes, but
this gets worse. It can't go on forever. Like this gets marginally, or it could possibly accelerate from here.
All things being equal, you want people to take their money, right? In abstract, you want people to want to invest here, and you want people from Dubai to invest in Canada, and you want people from America to invest in Canada, and you want Canadians to invest in Canada. But what we're seeing in the flows, and the data is quarterly data, anyone can Google it. I'm sure I put it on my Twitter before. And what you're seeing is direct investment, both foreign and domestic, is leaving Canada. And so we have a major direct investment outflow. And who could blame a Canadian? If you're a pension fund or you're an investor, you run a hedge fund in Canada, why would you invest in the Canadian economy when you have America, for example, down south, where they make it easy for you to return? And I think what's really crucial people understand is it's not about profits. What it is that investment leads to jobs. It leads to tax payments and tax takes, corporate or otherwise. It leads, and then it improves productivity. And the only way you can emancipate people is improving the productivity of your economy.
You're hitting on so much important point. Listen, we're a business here. We pay a lot of the advertising that we do in US dollars to the tech companies in the US. As the Canadian dollar collapses, our expenses are going aggressively higher. As the Canadian dollar changes, we're still paying in US dollars. So our expenses are going up. Our revenues as a real estate brokerage, I'm sure it'll be no surprise to you. It's like our gross revenues have not increased at the same rate that the Canadian dollar has fallen. And then on top of that, we have some clients who are saying, hey, listen, I got some Canadian real estate, but I don't really like what I'm seeing in Canada. So this is like the mom and pop investor who has a couple properties. Take me down to Florida and I'll buy a couple properties down in Florida. Help me set it up. And this is now our client base. Remember, we're a Canadian company. Mm-hmm. Now our client base is saying, we don't really want all our stuff here. Let's kind of go out and help us buy there. Now we're not set up in Florida, but as a Canadian business now, we're looking at ourselves and saying, do we reinvest in this country? Or do we take some of the profits that we would normally have reinvested right here in Ontario, in this country, that would create jobs right here? Do we take some of that money and deploy it down in Florida and open up shop down there? And so you see this extraction from people like me that don't want to do that, but I'm a business owner. I have to survive. This isn't about sometimes choice. This is about survival. And when you see the flows of money moving the way they are, you can choose to ignore it, or you can choose to make the decisions for your own survival. And I think sometimes this is like, I'm not saying we're a big business, and I'm not saying that we're employing hundreds of people, but that's just one example. And if you multiply that across smaller businesses across Ontario, how often is that happening? And then how often are those discussions happening? And then how often do you have Canadians that want to have US dollars in their bank account and not Canadian dollars? It's more and more. Sorry, I cut you off.
No. It's sorry. I who cut you off, so I apologize for that. I was just going to say the data. All I wanted to add was the data is very clear. Canadians are choosing to invest elsewhere, and in my view, who could blame them? And what's important to understand is like bias is super important to understand when you're thinking about economics. I'm shamefully biased about all kinds of things. I don't hide that. I try not to bullshit people, but I definitely am biased. And people have a domestic bias. So people would ultimately take a much lower return domestically than go elsewhere. And so I mean, I don't know, it's hard to prove that necessarily, but I think it's actually quite intuitive. And so for people to just say, oh, give up here and to move elsewhere, it's because there's something wrong, I wouldn't say it's broken. I just think there's something wrong. And most importantly, I think that given it can be fixed. Canada has been a real source for growth. And I don't necessarily think we should compete against Google. They have Silicon Valley. I don't think we could recreate that in Canada. What we can do, for example, is, make it easier for just cheap energy is a really good way to compete. Alcan is a really kind of dumb example, but it's a really important one. The reason Alcan, I don't know if it is as powerful now as it was once, but the reason it existed or began is because we parked a highly energy intensive business right next to a hydroelectric dam. Mm-hmm. So they were able to compete on price because their major input cost was so cheap, at whatever it was a kilowatt hour. And I'm just saying that's one way we can compete. We can compete on regulation. We can compete on making Canada an attractive place to live for employees. There's millions of different ways to compete. And so, but it seems to me that we're trying to do the opposite in every single category.
And it seems like, I know I'm laughing because it's so true, but you said a couple big things there, because when I mentioned some clients wanting to go to Florida, you're right. They would gladly just buy more income property here and get a lower return. It's difficult to set up shop go down and get the corporate structures down in Florida and do all this stuff. So it really has to be a big pain for people to do that. So the fact that we're seeing that happen means that there is an actual big pain here. And I'm not saying it's like a avalanche of people going there, but way more than we've ever seen before. And then something else you said there just on energy, that seems like the natural attack vector for Canada and the global economy, because we're sitting on so much of it, first of all, and just the way the economy is going, just more and more digital stuff and artificial intelligence. I used to work for a company called Oracle. Larry Ellison there, one of the richest guys in the world, just is putting down through Oracle $100 billion as their first take with nuclear energy. I think it's in Pennsylvania or Ohio. This is one tech company who is building a nuclear power plant in, I think it's Pennsylvania. Don't hold me to that, but it's 100 billion, not million. 100 billion. That's their first stake in the ground. $100 billion. And they said, this is just the start. Microsoft's doing it. Meta's doing it. Why wouldn't we open our doors and say, hey, we have this beautiful hydroelectric power in Quebec, or we have this other energy source coming out of Alberta? Why would we not get into that? And you can just see energies have become more and more and more of a factor going forward. And we're sitting on all of this stuff. Anyway, I'm just kind of ranting.
I think you've hit on a really, really important point, because I think there's this human beings consume lots of energy. By the way, the rest of the poor world is going to, and I mean the global South. I hate that expression, but just so we understand one another, their energy consumption budget is going up, not down. This is what humans do. We are a species that uses our brain to fight off the entropy of the universe. And one of the ways we've done this successfully is by creating energy, harnessing that energy of all kinds of different whatever, renewable included, etc., and turning that energy into basically not being cold and dying in a cave. Okay, so like that's my view. That's my anthropological survey. But the reality is that like what's fascinating is that if you really genuinely believe that fossil fuels are the problem, then my view is stop constraining that industry and take a supply side view of it. You know, why can't Canada build 20 nuclear power plants? We have enough engineers in this country. We have shitloads of cement, and we have space. If you're really worried about the risks involved of like nuclear waste, which I think is a total and complete red herring, probably invented by the fossil fuel industry, incidentally. But we have it. So like, okay, so you hate fossil fuels, fine. So then, man, build 20, 30 nuclear power plants across this country. In Nova Scotia, which burns 60% of Nova Scotia's energy, they burn coal. 60%. That's bananas. That's so dumb. Why don't you just plunk? There's nobody who lives in Nova Scotia. Just plunk a nuclear power plant somewhere over there and displace the coal in a much more, in my view, sustainable, long-term, viable way. And so to me, so that's the other piece. You know, there's like a real lack of imagination, I think, from our managers, and so that's what I find really, really fascinating. You know, instead of like, I don't want to get into the whole wind thing, but I just think we have Canada. And what's crazy is like Canada was a leader in nuclear energy. Like we literally had the CANDU reactor. That's like one of the. We sell that technology to South Korea. And we just aren't doing that here. And so. Again, you know what I mean? Like there's a real sort of lack of imagination that I find like hilarious. Like what else
you find laughable? I'm so happy you find it laughable, because sometimes I look around and I'm like, are we the only ones that think this is insane? Like, are there other people out there? And I think that's why I'm so excited to speak to you, Richard, because I'm like, holy shit, there are other Canadians who think this is insane.
Again, I don't know. The nuclear power thing just baffles me in a way. Like again,
especially now, from my understanding, with the newer nuclear reactors that are smaller, like they're from my understanding, I'm no expert, but they're very safe. They're much smaller than they were before. And if we produce, like you said, a lot of engineers. Like my son is just graduating from Western, a lot of engineers going down to the US. Why would we not keep those brains in Canada and produce something here? Like, why are we educating? You know what? One of my buddies, sorry, now I didn't mean to go off like this, but one of my buddies did work for Tesla. He was here in Ontario working on the electric vehicle. I think it was the RAV4 of Cambridge, Ontario. And it was like hybrid or something like that. He goes down to Tesla in the US and has been working down there ever since. Now he consults for them. He's like, Tom, why am I ever going to come back to Canada? Like, look at all the opportunity with everything that's going on down here. It's kind of like playing in the B league when I could be playing in the A league, and I'm not coming back. It's like, why don't we just create more opportunity to keep a brain like that in the country? Yeah. You know, and instead what we seem to do is manipulate interest rates around. So everybody's just chasing real estate. And I know we're a real estate brokerage. We can make fun of real estate all day long, Richard. It's like a wide open topic for us, because we find it also just that people are pushed into this corner like, oh my gosh, interest rates are going to come down. There's going to be more debasement of the money. I might as well buy a hard asset. The simplest thing for me, the average Canadian, to do is to buy a condo somewhere or buy a single family home rental somewhere. And I don't blame any of these people. They're pushed into a corner. And I guess, you know, maybe if I change gears just a little bit on us, could you explain to people from your perspective why Canada has such a heavy real estate based economy, or so many people buy either primary homes or, you know, rental properties? Where is that coming from, in your opinion? Could you, and I didn't prepare you for any of this.
No, sure. It's okay. I usually go off the cuff, so that's all right. I think there's two really important reasons. One is kind of a boring reason, but I think it is important. And the second reason, I think, is my view, the really sort of interesting, more complicated one. The first reason, I think it's hard to build businesses in this country. And I think if people felt that it was conducive to investment, both big and small, I think people wouldn't feel like the only way to build wealth is via the real estate game. That leads me to that's like the sort of the boring answer. Too much regulation, too much taxes. Everybody rolls their eyes. Everybody's heard that before. That leads to my second point, which is, in my view, and there's lots of really smart people who disagree with me, so take this for what it is, which is, for the last 10 years, or before COVID or whatever, we basically kept interest rates far, far too low. But most importantly, we kept them below the rate or the run rate of inflation. And what that does, or what that means from an economist point of view, is that you basically had negative real interest rates. So, this is a bit like, a galaxy brain here, but what you do is by running a monetary policy with a sustained negative real interest rate, you effectively are paying people to borrow. And what it incentivizes is a misallocation of capital to a cap game, which you're very familiar with, to the biggest sort of leverage game that you can play, because as you are effectively you are literally getting paid to borrow, right? Your interest rate is lower than your inflation. And so you look around and go, why would I take any kind of risk when I could just play a leverage game? And the problem with that is if you do that a little bit, then nothing really comes of it. If you keep interest rates negative for a long time, and I think in Canada it was like almost 12 years where you had inflation at 2, interest rates below that. And I've got a great chart on this, I'm happy to share. You incentivize people to allocate to this leverage game, and the best way to play that leverage game is via real estate. But the problem is humans are, just naked monkeys. You get this behavioral economics thing comes through. All of a sudden you hear your friend, they did well, blah, blah, blah. You look, house prices are up 10%, next year it's another 10%. And all of a sudden people who invested in a house that was worth 200 one day with 20% down, their house is worth 500,000, and they 10x their money over the last 10 years. I'm sure you're familiar with this story. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, once that trend starts, then everyone starts to go through that, and it's self-reinforcing. And before you know it, you've got house price to income rates at 10x, which is bananas. And people look around, they see somebody who started a business, who built something from the ground up, struggling and scratching and crawling to make some money and then get taxed at 50% of their income. When some other person bought a house, their primary residence, for $100,000, it's worth $1 million, and they get a tax-free return on their investment of $900,000. So who's the sucker? And so, and there's examples of this. Negative real interest rates, I think, is what caused the housing bubble in Spain, Ireland, and God help us, even Germany did it. Was suckered into it. Germany was having issues. People saw negative real interest rates. They started buying properties in Berlin. Berlin real estate went through the roof. And so nobody is immune from it, even the freaking Germans. And so that's the second piece is, to me, the really more interesting thing. So when we see interest rates starting to get cut, I just pray to the gods that they will keep interest rates positive in real terms, which will force people to make a proper asset allocation decision. Not I'm just going to plunk it into whatever leverage scheme that's du jour, but into I need to make a more return than the real interest rate that I could get from a government bond. And that will recalibrate people's psyche around, should I build a business and create and help productivity and employ people, or should I just take a loan from the bank and go and hit the beach? And so that's my little piece on that. I hope that was clear.
No, it makes perfect sense. I love the way you broke that down. And I love your optimism about the Bank of Canada, keeping things as rates in a positive territory. Because I guess I would be interested in real terms. In real terms. Yeah. In real terms. So I guess what I would say to that is, what are your thoughts? Or I guess what I'm interested in your opinion is, because I give this a lot of thought just myself, of like, how are they ever going to do that when the debt level is so high, and we're not getting the GDP growth that we really would like to be getting for all the reasons you just laid out over this last little bit here. aren't they just going to have to let inflation run hot? Because if they don't, the debt payments that are owed just can't be made. So like if you have debt at 100% of GDP, 110% of GDP, or whatever it is, 120% of GDP, however we're going to calculate. I know Canada uses net debt and does all this fancy stuff, but
net debt is total bullshit, by the way.
Total bullshit. Yeah. Thank you. I'm so happy you just said that. So it's like whatever, what's Canada's debt position right now? 120%?
So what they always quote is federal debt, which is again a total sleight of hand. Federal debt is relatively low. It's about 40 to 50%. I can't remember the number. But obviously the government of Canada is the lender of last resort. So if New Brunswick goes bankrupt, they're not just going to let New Brunswick starve. The federal government will come in and absorb that debt. So you have to include local and state and provincial debt as well, and that's about 100 or so. Then you have household debt's about 100, and then let's just say for easy numbers, the non-financial corporations are about 100 too.
Okay, so if for the debt situations, I guess we're going to calculate it in different ways, but I like the way you outlined it right there, is so high. How can they have real rates positive? It would mean to me that the debt is growing faster than the economy.
No. So, I think it's a chicken or the egg.
Okay.
And this is, so if we keep real interest rates positive, you're right, there will be a squeeze in terms of debt servicing, right? So debt servicing will take a non-trivial chunk of our sort of income, let's say in big brackets income. The problem is, but the way that you square that is productivity growth. If you just make every individual in Canada more productive and they generate more revenue in inverted commas, then you can actually service the debt because your economy is growing.
Okay, yeah. So you are a positive person. You are a positive person.
I am the son of immigrants. I'm the son of immigrants. I have nothing but optimism in my life. That's stupid. I mean, I'm a fucking fan of the Montreal Canadiens, so explain that to me. But
oh shit, I'm a Leaf fan. I should have asked you that right off the gates. We would have kept this much shorter. Shorter.
But no, so to me, that's why I hammer and hammer on this productivity piece, because if you are going to pay down this debt to improve the lives of, Joe's six pack, and you are going to deal with the problems that Canada has, which is hospital wait times, all these things that you need to improve productivity. You need more GDP per capita, and that means higher tax revenues. It means more.
Then it would work. Yeah, agreed. Okay. So I have a question for you then on this point, because if the main factors influence GDP would be productivity, population growth, and capital or debt growth, however we want to define capital, if productivity was to increase right now, and the demand side for that increased productivity doesn't also increase, I feel like the productivity is not really resulting in higher GDP, because
it would. Definitionally, it would. If you have if you have your population and population plus productivity equals GDP. So if you can what we've been doing the last few years is we have shit productivity, loads of new people, and then the people in Ottawa go on TV and brag about how our GDP is growing. But that's function. It doesn't matter. Tomorrow we can import all of China tomorrow, and our GDP would rise. But that's the meaning.
What
matters is GDP per capita. It means
and you're saying definitionally, because just by definition, if we're more productive, there's more revenue coming out per unit of labor going in, or however we want to say that.
Perfect.
So we get more. Okay. I guess where I was coming from is that with technology advancements and things just getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper.
That's another way of improving productivity.
I feel like that's a drag on a system that is going to require more and more growth. Like we're getting this almost as it's pulling us down because we need GDP to go up, but naturally technology is making things cheaper and cheaper and cheaper.
But actually, if I may, what's important to note is there's different ways that you can achieve productivity growth. So you think about it, inputs, output. If you have fixed output, but your inputs go down, you've improved your productivity. Mm-hmm. So if you have a fixed output and the cost of your technology goes down and down, you have that extra surplus, and that surplus can be taxed. That surplus can be distributed to poor people. That's, you know what I mean? And so you've increased your productivity. And so there's different ways to do it. You can keep your input locked in and increase your output, or you can keep your output locked in and decrease your input. Either way, you've improved the lot of lives for everybody in the world.
That's fascinating to me what you just said, and we're probably going to get too deep into this. Do you think you can fix No, it's great. I love it. No, I absolutely love it. Do you think you can keep the demand stable as productivity increases? Because I guess I was thinking that as productivity increases, part of the trouble with that is things get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. There's less revenue and less tax base to keep the demand where it is, so that like people are earning less because you need less labor to produce more goods. So now you have less income being created, you have less tax base creating. And so how do we kind of rectify that? I mean, we're probably going too deep into the weeds.
I think it's tricky. I do love this stuff. But no, I was thinking like you need to, I mean, if you think of costs as an input, it will change your sort of view on that. And also you have to understand, like once you create the surplus, right? Like one of the fascinating things about humanity and history is like once you open up, like the reason sort of the Industrial Revolution happened is because not everybody was spending 100% of their time trying to, find food. And what you do is with that time surplus, as well as the food surplus, you literally create avenues for people to explore to invent things, to create art, to write plays, to travel the stars, who knows, right? And so I don't know, maybe I am an optimist.
No, I love it.
That's why productivity is so important.
And if we use the productivity to create things that other nations and other sovereign states wanted, then of course we reap the benefit here. Yeah. So you could look at it. There's so many angles to look at this. Yeah. I love that.
That's why I think Carolyn Rogers of the Bank of Canada has gone to pains to say that and to write speeches about it. And like for the Bank of Canada is not only should be independent, who knows, it needs to be seen to be independent. So there's like sort of marketing aspect of it. But I think what's important to note is like they purposefully don't use strong language, right? It's to no one's benefit if the Bank of Canada or any central bank goes, oh, we're fucked. This is bad. That's bad. You know what I mean? Like that is not the, I would argue.
That's my approach. That's the way I handle it. Just so you know.
But you know what I mean? Sorry for swearing. I apologize, Greg.
No, you're good.
That serves no one. And so what you have to be when you're reading those speeches and hearing their talk, their language, and you have to like, it's like an auditor, like an auditor can never say this person's a fraud. They have to say they lacked a duty of care for basic managerial and accounting practices. You have to read between the lines. And so when Carolyn Rogers comes out and says, break glass, Canada is in a productivity emergency, behind the scenes, they're running around with their heads on fire going, there's a humongous problem in Canada. And I think and then one of the things I always stress is it's never just one thing. It's not only Justin Trudeau's fault. As much as it's not just, it's inter-provincial trade restrictions. Like why can't I buy insurance from a company in Nova Scotia? It's bananas. That makes no sense. Like, why can't we sell milk across the provincial border? I'm sorry, this is 2024. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like stuff like that. And it's also the fact that our country is strangled by oligopolies. And we know this. We know that there's only one airline, there's 6 banks, there's 3 telecom companies. If you have an oligopoly and you can extract higher economic rents because you face zero real competition, you're never going to invest in the latest technology. And of course, they'll come back and say, oh, our investment is the highest it's ever been. Baloney. We know that baloney. It's and so that's like Via Rail has an iron grip on our rail industry in this country. That makes no sense. We're the largest landmass, second largest landmass in the world. Put a fucking railway next to the one that exists. Like, what are we doing? And so it's never just one thing, but I think if you do have to boil it down, we need to work together to improve our productivity growth.
Okay, I'll wrap with this because I don't want to keep you too long. Do you have a few more minutes? Is that okay?
I'm having a great time. I hope I haven't scared away all your faithful listeners.
No, you're having it all. You're making no, not at all. With I guess with the U.S. election now passed, Trump in power, what do you think? And that's the number one question I'm getting. What does this mean to Canada, short term, medium term, long term? What do you see there?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One, I think we talked about flows and investment flows and how people in Canada are actually find the US as a more attractive destination to put their hard-earned money. I actually think that that's going to accelerate unless we do something to compete. And again, compete does not mean just lowering taxes. There's different ways to compete, right? Like I just think let's be more nuanced about it. But in general,
we can compete with healthcare. We can compete with education. There's a lot of ways to compete. Yes, agree.
Right. So taxes are too high, but
we all agree on that one.
I was just teasing. I was just teasing. But so I think,
that's the easy one. Yes, change that.
But
yes.
Donald Trump has a clear mandate. Hate him or love him, every single demographic shifted to the right. Every single one, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think there's one demographic in the U.S. They love to split up everybody into. And with that mandate, he will, I think, lower regulation, lower taxes, and encourage investment from around the world, not only just Canada, into the United States. And I think Canadians will see writing on. They might tell you at Thanksgiving they hate Donald Trump, but they're going to want to move their company to a state with no income tax, right? So
for survival, yes.
And so that's, I think that is a real risk to Canada. It's a flow argument. The other, however, there's another angle to this. As a strategist, I'm always doing one hand on the one hand or the other. The other thing is, the U.S. is our biggest trading partner. 97% of our oil goes to the U.S. 77%, if I'm not mistaken, 78, 76% of our merchandise trade, so goods basically. I can't remember the number for service exports. It goes to the U.S. So if the U.S. does well, they're going to buy more oil, buy more goods, buy more this, buy more that, and we stand to benefit. And so that's an important sort of consideration. And also, funnily enough, if the U.S. dollar rips, well, guess who's next door? And we could, why would you hire an accountant, whatever, in New York when you could pay for an accountant on Bay Street for 60% less or whatever? You know what I'm saying? That there's going to be some.
My tech job at Oracle, Richard, was a result of them deciding, hey, we can just hire people in Toronto to sell into Boston.
So, I mean, I think that so taking that point is important, right? Because you can extrapolate that in manufacturing and services, maybe not construction, but, in all kinds of shit. There's all different, these little.
No, construction too. I'm pretty sure we fabricate some stuff in Milton. I think it was Anatomy Homes at some point and shipping it across the border on trucks into the U.S.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, you might even have a truck driver who lives in what's the border city of Detroit? I can't remember.
Windsor.
And so you can have a truck driver in Windsor who just goes across the border, does his stuff, and comes home.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean? Rather than paying a Detroit driver to drive to Windsor and come home. So there's going to be lots of knock-on effects for that. I think, there's the political angle, of course, that no one wants to talk about. I think that Trump will probably put a lot of pressure on Canada and our defense. I think we've been...
For sure.
According to NATO, I don't take my word for it. Just go on the NATO website and just how much do we spend as a percent of GDP? We have not met our NATO agreement. Commitments. Everybody talks about. Everybody's like, oh, Trump is so bad against NATO. We are bad against NATO, right? All this talk basically about we think NATO is the most important thing in the world and blah blah blah. Well, how come we don't meet our NATO commitments? If we genuinely believe that NATO is the vital and most important thing to stand up to Russia and blah, 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 well, surely we should do our part and meet our NATO commitments, just like Estonia and Latvia and Poland and the rest of this crew. So that's another angle that I think that will have an impact on Canada's economy because, 2% of GDP is not nothing. And so it's just, I think these are the knock-on effects. But I think the reflexive attitude of Canadians is like, oh, I hate Donald Trump, maybe with good reason, maybe not. And so he's bad for Canada. It's like, well, maybe not. The Keystone Pipeline
That's exactly what I was going to say. Like maybe there's going to be some tariffs that he really like. I know he got into it with our dairy farmers and dairy and that kind of stuff. But maybe all of a sudden energy is like, oh, if our economy is growing and you have a lot of energy, maybe we need a pipeline. All of a sudden there's a pipeline going from Alberta to Texas. Right.
So there already are, by the way, there's like tens of thousands of kilometers worth of pipeline. The Keystone Pipeline is a politicized red herring, just so people understand. Again, the internet exists. Just Google Canada pipelines. You'll see there's maps and hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers worth of pipeline between America and the US. So that's that. But the other thing is so I think the dairy industry, for fear, I hope I don't get assassinated, but the dairy industry has way too much power in this country. I'm sorry.
Whenever I bring it up, we always get an email, and we have some clients who are dairy farmers and stuff, and I love them all, and I love great butter, and I just still talk about it,
I'm sorry. It's crazy they even have a lobby. Sorry. I'm sorry. But anyway, so I think that, again, I'll just to reiterate, when you watch, sorry to use this expression, when you watch mainstream media and it's like, oh, Trump bad, so it'll be bad for Canada. And I think if you're an analyst, as I pretend to be, it's not necessarily clear that that's at all true. I mean, there's he's unpredictable. He might look at Justin Trudeau and whatever. Oh, I hate you, and your whole cabinet constantly slanders me, so I'm not going to deal with you.
But I think your bigger point holds, and sorry for interrupting, is that if he grows that economy strongly there, we are the neighbor right next door. To your point, we get spillover effects of that. And some of that is going to be positive. I mean, let's face it. So
there's an old adage, right? If the US sneezes, we catch a cold. The opposite must be true, right? I mean, that just stands to reason. And so I think that's really important. Who knows? I think, who knows? I think that the country that's been eating our lunch, and Canadians don't want to say it, is Mexico. Mm-hmm. Mexico has been much, 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 much more either willing or able to work with the US to feed that consumer, feed both literally food and then also the manufacturing sector and the auto sector.
Richard, we have friends who are in Canada, educated here, who fly down to Mexico to manage factories and manage the production and the manufacturing of those Canadian plants down there, or Canadian owned through, I don't know what holding company structure or whatever, however it's defined, but they're basically Canadian companies manufacturing down in Mexico.
Yeah. And it's not, and by the way, we're never going to be able to compete on Mexico on the labor piece. So, okay, that's fine. But never. So let's not even, that doesn't enter into our thinking. We certainly can compete in Mexico on the technology piece, on the capital piece, like building high-tech manufacturing that may or may not compete on the services, but they are, if you look at their capital expenditure, so again, non-residential construction into structures, plant, equipment, blah, blah, blah. After years of being super flat, it's just massively gone up. This is a function of friendshoring. I don't know if your listeners may or may not know that, which is, the anti-China doctrine, which Trump started in 2016. Joe Biden took that and relished it. He took that football and ran it right into the end zone and spiked it. There's two very concrete examples. One is the CHIPS Act, which is literally we're going to pull money out of Taiwan and China and build semiconductor manufacturers in Arizona and whatever, and the data centers and all that shit. And he just they poured so much money into that. And it's let's make no mistake about it. That is the continuation of the Trump doctrine, of the anti-China Trump doctrine. Better or worse, you might not like it or not, but that is the reality. Joe Biden, that is a very clear angle of attack from Joe Biden. And the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, terribly named, but again, which is a transcendent piece of legislation, which encouraged basically the biggest increase in manufacturing and infrastructure development in probably 30 or 40 years in America. And so those two pieces of legislation had meaningful impacts to how the U.S. is operating going forward. And I think will have some knock-on effects with Canada. And if you look at Mexico's data, their capex has soared and Canada's gone the other way.
You're doing. I'm going to go back to you're a hopeful guy, Richard, and I hope I hope we do a big U-turn. And yeah, it's a great place, great people in this country, and so much potential. And I want to give you the rest of your day, so we'll wrap it there because I had more stuff. We touched on 20% of the stuff I wanted to ask you. By the way, you do such a great job.
What about one more question just to send me on my way?
Well, I guess
I'm having fun.
The one, okay, there's a few here. I guess you mentioned China briefly, and I don't know if there was another angle that you were going to talk about China. I think you said, oh, we'll talk about that later. I was curious do you remember what you were going to say? We might have been talking about energy.
I mean, to me, the piece the really blind spot for people with respect. This is my this is my view, and I guess it's all my view, but I'm going to get in trouble for this one, but the real blind spot
you've got in trouble a lot. The whole episode, you're getting in trouble a lot. I'm going to send you a note on all the points. You know what? We'll let you listen to this first. So anyone listening to this know that we'll let Richard listen to it and it'll be all edited out. I'm joking. I'm completely joking. It's not.
No. But the China piece is interesting because we have this view, and I think there's a real blind spot in Canada that they are the leaders of renewable energy and they are leading the way on renewable energy for the world. And in some ways, that is 100% true. They produce, the lion's share of solar panels, and certainly the components that are put in the solar panels manufactured elsewhere. They produce an incredible amount of wind, blah, blah, blah. But make no mistake about it, they're not getting rid of coal. They're doubling down on coal. Coal is a shrinking part of their energy mix, but in absolute terms continues to rise and rise and rise. And that's a fact. So until I see a chart or a table or a data that contradicts that view, when that comes, I will change my mind. But the data is very clear. They are consuming more and more and more coal every year. And Canadians think that they are China's some sort of leader in renewables. Baloney, right? So they are, and so that's vital that people just I sometimes I get exasperated because I feel like people don't know, but maybe it's my job to share that information. And that's a fact. I mean, the data, go to a website called Our World in Data. Great website. They break everything down per capita, different types of fossil fuels, renewables. It's an incredible, incredible resource that covers all of this for 100 whatever countries. It's a fascinating, amazing, amazing piece of data. And, you will see, in my view, what is very obvious, which is China, India, Indonesia, and half a dozen other Asian and African countries are doubling down on coal. And so that's just the reality of the situation. And so when we are trying to destroy our domestic energy industry, I think it's important to keep that in the front.
Inaccurate thing. Yeah. Okay. I love it. Okay. I'll throw something else since you're willing to keep going here. I'm going to throw you another. I'm interested in your thoughts. Sometimes I look at Canada's M2 and I'm like, okay, M2 is growing at this rate. Real estate seems to grow at the same rate in the Toronto real estate area anyway, seems to match M2 growth pretty closely, compounded 7% a year as far back as you can go. There's going to be slight changes to that. So then we talk with some clients saying, hey, listen, real estate just kind of matches the debasement in the country. If you use leverage on rental properties, that's really the benefit of getting into some real estate. It's the leverage. You'll put 20% down. If it's 7% average over medium and longer terms, not in the short term, medium and longer terms, you're getting a 35% return on that. So that's really why real estate benefits. It's not really real estate in and of itself. It's just that you get the leverage on that thing and the income pays for it. It's kind of pretty basic. When I just say Canada's M2 to you, anything come to mind? What are your thoughts on that? I look at it right now. I look at it more as the real rate of inflation for me. I'm like, okay, if they're debasing at that rate, I need to beat that rate for my family to protect its purchasing power, because if they're diluting at this rate, it doesn't matter if I'm making 5%, because if they're diluting M2 at 7%, and you could argue maybe I'm just shouldn't be looking at M2, but that's kind of for me right now, that's a big one. And then if I layer in productivity gains that I think we should be gaining that are kind of hidden in this economy of, let's say 3, 4, 5% a year that we should be gaining that we're not realizing, I'm like, I really should be getting, the real rate of inflation here is maybe like 7% debasement plus the 5% productivity that I'm not seeing. Maybe it's like 12%. and I need to really make some investments to beat that, to stay ahead of this whole game. When I say that, and I said a lot to you there, or maybe I didn't, what comes to your mind when I just throw that out? Like, what comes to your mind? Inaccurate thinking? Why are you looking at them too?
You've given me a lot to think about. I've never really, to be perfectly honest with you, I've never really thought of money supply growth as sort of the real.
And I know that's
more accurate form of inflation.
I will say one thing, like that's the hurdle rate. It's like, very simple, super simple.
No, I think it's actually a really good idea. I think you need to be careful because some of M2 includes sort of the monetary base, like includes like reserves and stuff. And so I would suggest that you pull some of that out.
Okay.
Because you can remove monetary base from M2. But I think in more broadly speaking, I think you've hit on something that's really, really important, which is assets it's not that assets are worth more. It's that money is worth less, which is a kind of a fancy way of saying money debasement. But I think when you couch it in those terms, people have a better grasp of it, which is assets. It's not that the S&P 500 is worth more. It's that the money is worth less and less. And I think the way that you've sort of used M2 to sort of express that from like a monetary standpoint, I think is a really clever one. I think just one thing though, productivity is deflationary, it's disinflationary. So you have to be careful. If productivity really is 5%, then you would probably, that's a good thing for you. Although maybe that would add to your hurdle rate. I don't know. I think that's just a really, really interesting way.
I'm only adding it to my hurdle rate because I'm like, I should be reaping the benefits of that 5%.
Oh yes, that is a good, sorry, you were right.
So that's why I'm adding it, because I'm like, well, I'm not reaping the 5% because it's stuck in this weird way we measure our economy and function.
I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Sure. And I'm not trying to say it's the holy grail. And
no, you've left me with homework. I like this.
Well, to be fair, I just want to give credit where credit is due here. There's an author, Canadian guy on the West Coast, Jeff Booth, who's been on our podcast several times, who wrote The Price of Tomorrow, Deflation is the Key to an Abundant Future. And it was reading that book. It's a really short read, like so well laid out. Entrepreneur in Canada. I don't know if you've heard his name before, but he laid that out in that book so plainly for me that it kind of caught me off guard. And it kind of gave me that thing. So I don't want to take credit for this type of thinking, Richard, just so you know who you're dealing with here. Simple guy from Mississauga, two brothers over here. We don't know what we're doing.
No, it's been a pleasure. It's honestly been a real pleasure to chat with you. And I'm really grateful really for the opportunity to sort of express myself in this forum, to talk about things I'm really super passionate about. And I've done a lot of work on. I mean, I just want the best for Canada. I want the best for Canadians. And I feel like we've left so much on the table, and I think for really, in my view, for luxury beliefs that you can have when things are going really well, when interest rates are low, when debt levels are low. It's a luxury belief. If I can just end maybe on this last thing, it's like I think of Canada as sort of a trust fund baby. It doesn't matter how badly we screw up. We have this trust fund of 168 billion barrels of oil sitting in the ground for us to exploit at our leisure, even if we make all the worst decisions with that. We have so much money in the ground, so to speak, that even if we invest badly, which we have, we squander it, which we do, we give it away to our friends who don't deserve it, which we also do, blah, 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 that we're just still rich. And none of the bad decisions that we make, we ever feel. And as a trust fund, but there are some trust fund babies who are super highly motivated, who are desperate to contribute to the world, and who are passionate about growing that wealth and giving money to charity and investing in the future and blah, blah, blah. And I just hope that, we transform from a trust fund baby that makes, we can be the other, there are two types of trust fund babies. And I hope that over the next little while that we sort of change and go from a trust fund baby that, that is an idiot basically, to one that's not. And that's the way I kind of view Canada. And I think we have a real opportunity to do something, to really contribute, whether it's in nuclear power and in the area of human rights, or to be custodians of one of the most beautiful woodlands in the world and all the water and the fish. And like, we really can do it. We have the money, we care, and so for me, it's just a real lack of imagination. And I think I am hopeful. I am optimistic. Being the son of a penniless immigrant, I think sort of gets you that far, I think.
Great way to end off. And I just want to thank you that the clarity that you provide a lot of us here by the work that you do as an analyst and the way you share data is really helpful, because it helps give someone like me context to what is going on. The way you visually present the data, for me, maybe it's just the way I learn, but I'm sure other people are telling you the same thing. You are really serving a lot of Canadians in the data that you're putting out and the way that you're sharing information. So sometimes when you're putting these charts together and you might be thinking, why am I even doing it? Well, I know I can clearly tell you love it, but just know you're really impacting a bunch of us, because some of us out here are trying to make sense of what's going on in this country. And then when we see your charts and your data and now your YouTube videos, you're serving all of us. And I think it allows us to have better conversations across the country when we can understand the data. So thank you for what you're doing. Keep doing it. I'm definitely going to bug you. Now that I've gotten to know you, I'm like, holy shit, I got to have this guy back on, because we could talk for more about a lot more stuff. So I just want to thank you. You took a risk. You don't know us. So thank you for coming on. Our audience, I know, is going to love this. So I'll be bugging you again. And I just want to let everybody know, because I think you're not going to mention it, but I will put it in the show notes. But the YouTube channel to go to is IceCap Asset Management. So if you just Google IceCap, one word, asset management on YouTube, you're going to find Richard's videos. And then on Twitter, Richard is at RichardDiaz_CFA. So we'll put links in the show notes too, but on Twitter, you should definitely be following him as well, at RichardDiaz_CFA, because he's putting out so much great stuff. And I know our audience is going to love what you're putting out. So yeah, Richard, thank you so much.
It means a lot to me, honestly. I do sometimes wonder if I should or shouldn't, and to hear you say that so forcefully means it just really encourages me to keep going. Really.
Keep going. Yes.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you.